And also, secondly, about China, you are correct in saying that China became the manufacturing center for the world. And I also alluded to that in my last slide by saying we liberalized the financial sector before we liberalized the real sector. And China did the opposite. They are now liberalizing their financial sector. But initially, they opened up their real economy and asked foreigners to come and set up shop there, even to export to the world and employ Chinese labor. So there are certain things that we were somewhat greater in throw to the Western received wisdom than China was. And to some extent, that is why we missed the boat on the manufacturing. But it is not too late, in my opinion. We can still get back. But I don't think we can make our manufacturing, we can skip the manufacturing bus at all completely. It won't be enough to solve our demographic and the young population's employment income needs. I don't think so. And that is why it's important to dismantle the inspection, license and manufacturing Raj, and it's also important to create the infrastructure, reduce logistics costs, etc. And in that case, we can actually compete with the Bangladeshs and the Vietnams of the world for textiles, for footwear, all those kinds of manufacturing, which still continue to employ thousands of labor. So we need to do that. I don't think we have missed the bus. I wouldn't say India has already suffered premature deindustrialization, as Arvind Subramanian and Danny Roderick mentioned it. I would say India's problem was that it was premature international trade and finance liberalization rather than premature deindustrialization. And we can rectify that.
Right. Can I also ask you, because I'm not seeing, questions coming in, maybe because of the internet issues. I still invite people to write me if they can. They send a chat question, raise your hand if you're joining us on Cisco, or please send me a question by email if you want to. But I had another question about what you mentioned about, money printed in the developed economies.
Yeah.
And you're saying we need the capital. So you're saying that hopefully we will continue to, get the money. And you said that our FDI export is less than the amount of money coming in also. But my question is that how do these advanced economies, and you also mentioned Chinese debt being really high. Now, how do the advanced economies propose to inflate themselves out of debt, as you mentioned? And if it's so simple, why don't we also print so much money? I mean, what are we afraid of?
No, all the questions that you are raising are so important and so amenable to a day-long brainstorming. So, and it is very difficult to kind of give a condensed answer. I would say, that is the exorbitant privilege that the developed world has compared to developing world. I mean, if we try to do what they are doing, which is what we tried in the 2000 beginning, not that we tried deliberately, but unconsciously, that's what happened between 2009, 10, 11, 12, and 13. In those 5 years, India had double-digit inflation rates every year. And the net result was that the Indian rupee went from 45 rupees to $1 to 68 rupees to $1 by 2013. And in those 5 years, even though the government of India at that time was running a lot of deficits, that overall debt to GDP ratio came down because the denominator was growing bigger, the nominal GDP, because we were having high inflation. So we were, in a way, inflating our debt away in those 5 years, although that was not a conscious strategy. But now in the developed world, but we paid a price in terms of the rupee becoming extremely weaker. And we were considered as part of the fragile 5 economies of the world, along with South Africa, Turkey, India, Indonesia, and Brazil. We were considered a fragile 5. So that was sort of the consequence, and naturally it makes our imports like petroleum products, etc., much more costlier. Whereas the developed world, because of the credibility and whatever be the logic behind it, it enjoy whatever the credibility they enjoy with the financial markets, they can get away with it without some of the adverse consequences that we face. In the sense that if your currency depreciates, like Indian rupee did between 2009 and 2013, not only imports become costlier, but whatever borrowings we have in dollars become much more difficult to repay.
Correct,
Much more
correct.
expensive. But America doesn't have to worry about it. It borrows in dollars, it pays back in dollars. It is somebody else's problem. In fact, it is the lender's problem. And that is why they can inflate their debt away and we can't. And when we try to do that, we did face a lot of problems. So developing countries cannot, unfortunately, whether it is justified or not, cannot emulate what the developed countries can do because they borrow and lend in their own currencies and they can get away with it and we can't, unfortunately.
Yeah, but it makes you think, you have money available in Europe at minus, I mean, it's
Yes.
zero interest. Now,
That's
what
right.
what prevents someone from borrowing there and putting it in India at 6%? I mean, this is a crazy.
That's what they're doing. That is why I say there is a lot of scope for money to come in. But the downside of it is too much of such money can come in, which is not meant to stay long in India. They can they're just coming for the 6%, as you correctly put it. 6% versus 0% there, or even negative. Of course, negative you don't get for ordinary people, but for banks. But let's say if you're an ordinary European investor who's a bit savvy and you can use your laptop to open brokerage accounts everywhere and can transact, you can borrow at 1% and let's say deposit in India at 6% and but you are not there for the long term. So you will be very interested for some time and then you will take your money out after some time. That is what they call in the jargon hot money. Hot money will come in, hot money will go out without rhyme or reason. And that is not what we are after. We are after what we call the money that stays. And even that, I think we are a better place than before. It's all important for us to channel these monies available to us into the right sectors. So if you look at the first decade of the new millennium, when we had a high growth rates, 2003 to 2008, money went into somewhat more unproductive sectors. So if we can learn the lessons of the first decade, when a brief purple patch of high growth lasted 5 years, we should ensure that we don't have another flash in the pan kind of situation, and we're able to sustain the growth rates of around 7 to 8% on an aggregate basis for 10 years. Then the transformation you will see even in ordinary people's lives will be very visible and very significant. So we need to avoid repeating the mistakes of the first decade when we were seduced by the monies coming in and it went to all kinds of unproductive sectors.
I mean, it's a related question. You said the IMF has predicted that the rupee will go down to 80, 85 maybe.
Implicitly.
Implicitly, but you also said that may not actually happen. You mentioned that as well.
Yeah.
But here we want to do be a $5 trillion economy. We've set ourselves a goal. We are close to being a $3 trillion economy. But if the rupee keeps, declining, then even if our rupee economy expands, the dollar economy will remain static.
Correct.
So you mentioned, in fact, that the real and the nominal GDP, the gap will be reducing, because if you grow faster, the gap will reduce over a period of time. But do you think that that's actually going to happen, or the same, rise in petroleum prices, our own dependency, which hasn't come down, and the other problems that you mentioned, will keep us in that same situation where the rupee keeps declining? And you don't think so? Okay, go ahead.
No, actually, no. What I was trying to say is that very chart is what I have in front of us here, and I mean the The average rupee depreciation per year in these forecasts, implicit in these forecasts, is around 3 to 4%. And if the nominal GDP, nominal growth economy grows at 12%, minus 4% in real terms or in dollar terms, we will be growing at 8%. So even if the rupee were to become weaker against the dollar, as these forecasts imply, I don't think that will necessarily completely eliminate or neutralize the growth rate that is happening in rupee terms, and in dollar terms we will. In fact, these predictions are showing that in the next 6 years we will be growing from 3 towards 4.5, which is a 50% increase over 6 years, and that roughly translates into 7.5% in dollar terms. In dollar terms, all I'm saying is this 7.5% could be as high as 10 or 11 or 12 if rupee, instead of weakening, actually becomes stronger against the dollar, and the possibility of that happening does exist.
Exactly. I was coming to that because there are many, contrarians that you hear who are saying that the dollar is the biggest bubble. They don't trust the dollar.
That's right.
They are moving, many are moving to Bitcoin and other hedges
That's right.
because they think the dollar is a completely overinflated currency, and it's a bubble about to burst. What do you think about that?
No, I think that is a very possible scenario. However, it will be obviously profoundly destabilizing for the world, and it will have an impact on everybody, because the last time the baton passed on from sterling to the US dollar, it was between two culturally compatible countries, and the passing of the baton was relatively peaceful in one sense, although the World War II was a trigger. But between 45 and 1960, effectively the UK pound became less important and dollar became more important, because the United States was indeed the only country left standing after the World War II. So if something similar happens, and I don't think any country in the world, whether it is China or the Eurozone as a geographical region, is in a position to take over from the US dollar. So we may have a period of little bit of chaos and uncertainty if the dollar were to lose its role in the world, because of the kind of policies that they are following today in the United States. So that risk is definitely there. It is material risk, in my opinion, especially for the second half of this decade. But if it happens, it will be profoundly destabilizing for the world, because we don't have an alternative in place waiting to take over and smoothly become the globally responsible hegemon, which America was, at least for a brief period post World War II. I think that those enabling conditions don't prevail now, and therefore it could be quite an important disruptor for the world, but not in a very positive sense. But the risk is definitely not trivial.
Yes, yes, indeed. And this is probably the last question, since we haven't heard from others.
Okay.
We come back to China. You already hinted that China, though it wishes to, cannot easily displace the US
That's right.
as the world's number one power. And of course, China has more US paper than any other country. Trillions and trillions of dollars of treasury bonds and bills are owned by China. So, in other words, if the US goes down, China is also going to go down. If for some, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No. Continue.
Exactly. So, and then there's also the collateral aspect that the Chinese rise is no longer peaceful, as Deng Xiaoping used to say. It's become the regional bully. It's become the global bully with its Road and Belt Initiative. It's the South Pacific and the China Sea and all of that. It's got boundary disputes with 9 countries. So and it's buying up resources in Africa, etc. So the real question is what does the Chinese economy look like in the future? Because we are also told that you can't trust their numbers. Many people say that you don't know exactly what's going on there.
Mm.
And finally, with what's going on in Hong Kong,
Mm.
because there's a capital flight from Hong Kong, there's a capital,
Mm.
and whenever the Chinese open up a window for
Money flows.
currency,
Money leaves
yeah, lots of capital flight,
out of
and
China.
lots of millionaires are leaving China. Also, millionaires are leaving India as well. I'm told.
That's right.
So don't we have a very uncertain situation in the world where the US
Yeah.
is no longer able to police the world and
Yes.
hegemonize and maintain law and order? They're getting out of Afghanistan. They're getting out of other places. Iraq, they want to get out of. And Biden's foreign policy is different from Trump's. Luckily, his fiscal policy is not as socialist as was feared. Anyhow, and China's rise comes with its own, what should I say, warnings and dire predictions for the rest of the world. Don't you think the world economy seems to be, looking ahead at a very uncertain future? And given that scenario, isn't it also an opportunity for India to fill in a vacuum? There's a vacuum, even as as a regional power, not as a global power.
No,
And
I think we,
I think that
yeah.
some people are saying we are
Yeah.
already missing the bus, whereas some people are saying, no, investing in infrastructure, trying to improve access, trying to reach basic necessities, gas, water, electricity, to the average household in India, even to the far off places, which I have seen with my own eyes in Himachal and other regions. Every place is electrified. The roads have gone to every corner of India. Now that's going to make a huge impact, is what they're
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
But the question really is, what about the productive potential, the productive capacities of the people? When are these going to be unleashed? Given that, I mean, look at the farmers' protest. Even agribusiness, there is a huge hold on it because of two or three states who are beneficiaries of this subsidy system, you may call it. In fact, I read about trucks being smuggled from Bihar into Punjab to avail of the MSP, and per truck they
Yeah.
make.
That's right. That's right.
So go ahead. I'm done. You
No,
have the
no,
last word to sum up.
sure, sure. No, that was again a sort of a package of issues. So yes, China owns a lot of U.S. Treasury, and yes, China will be impacted if the dollar were to collapse. So in this sense, it's like saying if you owed 100 rupees to the bank, you should worry. But if you owed 100,000 rupees, then the bank should be worried. That's the kind of thing. So yeah, so China definitely with the dollar bonds it owns, it will be adversely affected. And I think China itself, as we discussed so many times, its own economy isn't perfectly healthy, it's fragile, and there are still lots of bond default, borrowers defaulting on their loans happening in China as we speak. And there are also obviously internal political rumblings as well, which we don't get to hear about. So I think so there is definitely one economy, the big one, the existing status quo power in different stages of decline, whether it is political, social, or economic, and the other one not quite ready to assume the responsibilities that go with it, but wanting to assume the power that comes with it. So then you have a tension that is building up in different parts of the world, whether it is Taiwan or Hong Kong, or for that matter between Russia and Ukraine, etc. So I think we do have a fairly difficult, unstable few years ahead of us. And you mentioned, does it not lead to an opportunity for India? And the answer is yes. I mean, you mentioned about the examples of roads and street lights, electrification happening in Himachal Pradesh. And there are multiple production linked incentive schemes that the government has announced in various sectors. And you can see that whether it is, as I mentioned, in the freight corridors or in the railway infrastructure or road infrastructure. So I think anytime we look at India, there will be hundreds of things that are yet to be done, but there are also tens and twenties of things that are being done as well. And the very fact that the money that talks is responding to what are, notwithstanding the commentary that we read in the newspapers and media. The fact is, people with the money are putting their trust in India, whether it is direct investment or portfolio investment coming into India. India is seeing that is the proof of the pudding. So I think the answer is there is an opportunity for us, and I don't think we are. It's a double negative. I don't think we are not exploiting it. So basically what I'm saying is I think we are exploiting the opportunity. We have lowered the corporate tax rate for new manufacturing establishments. We are creating the public infrastructure. The government has said it will vacate all sectors except strategic sectors and hand it back to the private sector. So I think we are making some bold departures from the past, and they need to be welcomed, because there will always be uncertainties with these new policies. But the fact remains that 70 years of a particular set of policies has given us mediocre progress. And we need to take some leaps into the unknown and then be prepared to reverse course if they don't work out. And I think that is what we are doing. And that is why I call my presentation a glass more than half full. So we are stepping up to the global vacuum that is emerging.
Thank you, Ananta. I hope you can give us a write-up. Also, we'd like to publish your
Sure.
presentation. I think I completely resonate with you, especially as we move to the end of this session. The world is not moving from a unipolar global order to a multipolar, but from a unipolar, or if not unipolar, an alliance of Western powers to heteropolarity. It's not a simple transition. And this heteropolarity is a time of great opportunity for India, especially because after the Wuhan virus, if we may call it that, there's a tremendous sense of global distrust, even anger directed against China, and not just because of the virus, but because of their other bullying tactics.
That's right.
And India seems to offer an alternative with a stable, relatively stable government and governance structure, legal framework, whereas in Russia, there's no proper legal framework if you want to resolve a dispute.
That's right.
And with its history of democracy, successful parliamentary democracy, smooth transition of power, even between opposition parties, all of these, and a very deep and experienced business class going back to hundreds of years, the oldest stock exchange in Asia, and many global companies emerging worth more than $100 billion capitalization. So this creates a trust factor in India. It's a country which is large with a consuming young population. We're soon going to be, I think, over China in terms of our population. More than 1.3 billion we already are. And all of this makes us attractive. But we shouldn't miss the bus. We have to get our act together, as you said. We have to deregulate where it's required and re-regulate also, because there's a free for all in some sectors. Fly-by-night people come, cheat people. The banking system needs reform, not only because of NPAs, but because of the nexus between corrupt officials and politicians and loan takers who will default. We know it from the beginning. So a poor person can't get a loan, but if you want to borrow 2,000 crores and if you manage the right fix, then you can get it and even run away. So there's a lot to do, but it's an exciting time. And I'm so happy that we have experts of your caliber to give us the right feedback and to also speak truth to power, which is what intellectuals should do, not only in your columns, but I'm sure that the finance ministry takes your advice very seriously. And I tend to think that overall we are in good hands. So thank you for your time. Thank you for that brilliant presentation. And see you in person here after the COVID. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And and take care. Thank you, Ananta. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Makaran. Thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to being there with you all physically at some point in time soon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.